some of the other Reformed theologians, and his name's John MacArthur, and I want to see what he has to say and where he comes from in Reformed theology. And then I wanted to look also at Reformed theology as it relates to baptism. And then with that, we will turn into a new series in a couple of weeks. Next week, actually, is going to be another one of the Stump the Pastor nights. It'll be a Q&A, theological Q&A. So maybe you've had a question about any of this topic or any biblical or worldview doctrinal question, and we'll do that next Wednesday night, along with green chili chicken stew, right, for supper. And I'm sorry? Pork. Yes, we're in the age of grace, and so we'll go with pork, and we'll do that, and then we're starting a new series, which I'll announce later. But let's come into this last session and see a couple of things that we've got here tonight. And the first will be an analysis of John MacArthur's Calvinism. Now, John MacArthur, almost everyone has, of course, heard of John MacArthur. Many people have read John MacArthur's books. He is a prolific author, and heard his sermons, perhaps, heard his television program, Grace to You, or his radio program. And he is one who, unlike so many people in the theological, in the television world, he is not name it and claim it. He is not a heretic. And that puts out almost everyone else, doesn't it? But he's neither of those. He very much is one who preaches verse by verse and book by book, and all of that I very much appreciate. And so much of what John MacArthur does and says I would agree with. But he's got this one issue of holding to this Tulip system or Reformed soteriology. He is a Calvinist. He does believe in Reformed theology, that I have come to the point where I really can't recommend John MacArthur, because Reformed theology comes up almost everywhere, just over and over again. And so it's very hard to do it. So I want to look at this now. You say, well, how in the world do you pick something up like this? I want to start with just a little bit of an intro, and talk first of all about how to deliver a flawed argument. This is free. Just in case you want to deliver a flawed argument, I want you to know how to do it. And here is how you do it. The first thing you do is you deliver a story or a statistic, but statistics aren't very fun. But everybody loves a story, right? So you deliver a story that will get everyone on board with you. And if the story involves children or old people, that's even better. Because everybody loves children and old people, and your heart goes out and you feel bad. Get some handicaps in there, something that'll pull the heartstrings, and get it in there and show an atrocity. Here is an atrocity that involves this child, this poor widow woman, this man who served our country well and lost 3 legs and an arm, and really draw it in and bring it, and then use that story or statistic basically to get everyone on your side. Now, why do I say this? This is going to have something to do with John MacArthur in just a moment. But I say this also because you need to be aware that my mantra to you over and over is to question the assumptions. And so whenever you start hearing a story, especially at the beginning of the presentation, your little radar ought to go up and say, why is he telling me a story first? I want the facts. I'd like the facts. In fact, you know that we just came from visiting our daughter and son-in-law, and I was having a lunch with our son-in-law and his pastor, and the pastor looked to Jack and said, they were talking about the coming baby, and said, well, Jack, what do you think it is? Do you still feel it's a boy? He says, yes, I feel very strongly it's a boy. And I said, Jack, honestly, it has to do with chromosomes, not your feelings. I'm a little bit of a Dr. Spock when it comes to all that, I mean, feelings that, and I think it's because I've been manipulated so many times that I don't let people manipulate me anymore. So it's just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And sometimes that might be a little boring, but be wary when you start hearing these stories that get your audience on the side. Now then, if the second thing you do to present a flawed argument is create some kind of a link. It doesn't have to be a strong link. It doesn't have to be a logical link. It can be the flimsiest of links to get from that story to your proposition. And in fact, I have taken a couple of slides out of here. For those of you who have the handout here, you'll see there's two slides that we're not going to show in just a moment, and there's one of them that has a YouTube address, and you can go watch this if you want. But I found a YouTube story. It's a couple of years old, and it was do you remember a few years ago when the government was going to shut down because the Republicans, I believe it was, wouldn't authorize the spending, and the what do they call it? The fiscal cliff, I think. The fiscal cliff. Remember how we were all going to fall off the fiscal cliff? And I found a news clip, and guess what it was? It was about a 2.5-minute story, which is pretty long on the news, and 2 minutes of it were first minute was about a woman who worked in a hospital all of her life, and now she lived on $976 of Social Security income. And she's going to lose it. The second was a child who has autism. His single mother works all the hours she can in order to care for him, and he's in a government-funded program, and guess what? It's going to be cut off. Now, that's atrocious, isn't it? This poor woman isn't going to have any income. This poor boy isn't going to have anyone to care for him, no education. And then, yes, you got it. And then they bring in, of course, the president who says, I can't guarantee that these are going to be funded after August the 11th. And there's the connection. You see the connection? Here's the story. Now this flimsy little connection that brings it, whether or not there ever is the possibility that this woman was not going to get her Social Security check after this took place, which, by the way, if you knew the facts of the story, you would know that was zero possibility, even if the government did absolutely nothing. But this pulls it together. Well, then you've got them all on your side. You say, wouldn't it be horrible if this woman didn't get her Social Security and this child wasn't taken care of? That would be atrocious. Now, who wants that to happen, huh? You, John, you probably do, don't you, right? And they paint an enemy. But the problem is the enemy doesn't really exist. There's nobody who really that's their agenda, and they're out to get this. And so They use logic about a lot of people worked hard and all these kind of things. They bring it all together. In the case of what we're going to look at tonight, they use Scripture, and then your audience goes away with you saying, "Well, he's a very smart man, and he is avoiding a disaster that could happen." Now, I bring all that up because if you read John MacArthur's book, "Ashamed of the Gospel," he writes in it, and of course, if you just look at it, there's so much of it that's going to be conservative, solid biblical arguments. But he has one chapter called "The Sovereignty of God in Salvation," and the sovereignty of God in salvation. In this chapter here, he begins with a story. Isn't that interesting? And the story that he begins with is the story of Jesus dolls. And he talks about some organization that has created Jesus dolls. They're rag dolls, actually, that are Jesus dolls because people need a Jesus they can actually hold on to. And then he changes that story just a little bit, and he talks about Jesus action figures. And here's a Jesus that's strong and muscular, and you can manipulate him. And the whole idea here is then that there are people out there who believe that you can manipulate God. Isn't this terrible? Well, my goodness. Jesus is not a doll, is he? And do any of you believe that Jesus is a doll, by the way? Do any of you believe he's manipulatable? God is No, we don't believe this, but there's this atrocity that is painted that someone out there does believe this. And so then he comes in and he brings some quotes, and he says, for example, too many think of him, this is God or Jesus, too many think of him as someone who can be manipulated any way they please rather than the utterly sovereign Jehovah of the Bible. And of course, there's that implication, are you one of them? Do you believe you can manipulate God and get out of him whatever you want? And he then comes into this issue of sovereignty when he says, no doctrine is more despised by the natural man than the truth that God is absolutely sovereign. Now, here's what he's done. Painted a picture of something that's atrocious, made a flimsy little connection, and said the most heinous doctrine there is that God is not sovereign. And now the picture is set up in your mind that if you don't believe in the sovereignty of God, he's going to go into this idea that you would believe, for example, if somebody could choose to accept God or reject him, why, that denies the sovereignty of God. You can't manipulate God like that. You see, he all of a sudden gets into this thing that he's bought your attention first. He's bought your allegiance almost first. And this is something that I think every preacher and politician knows to do, is never start with the bad news. Always start with the things that everyone's going to agree with you with. If you want to find this used in the Bible, look at the book of Amos. Amos comes and he says, the Assyrians, they're terrible, right? How many believe the Assyrians are terrible? Amen. You know, and the people from Tyre and the people from Sidon, he gets all the enemies around and everybody's with him. And then he says, now let's talk about you all. And he gets in. But they said amen so many times that he's bought their credibility. And now people can't cut them off at the pass, so to speak, because they've signed on the dotted line almost before you even get to the actual argument. Now, he comes along again. No doctrine is more despised by natural man than the truth that God is absolutely sovereign. He says on page 164 of this particular book, he says, God orders everything. He controls everything, rules over everything. Nothing comes to pass except according to his eternal decrees. All this to prove that Jesus is not a doll or an action figure. He's sovereign, right? And then he has what I think is a great contradiction. The same page as God controls everything. He says, then believers deserve no credit for, excuse me, I'm going to come up later with what I thought was a contradiction. This is the wrong one. So God is sovereign. And then he says, believers deserve no credit for any aspect of their salvation. Now, if you believe anything otherwise, then God's a rag doll. You've manipulated God. I want to say, first of all, I reject TULIP. If you've been with me long enough through here, you know I reject TULIP. I also don't think you can take credit for your salvation. So this is a false argument here, that those who reject the idea that nothing comes to pass except God brings it according to his eternal decree, that includes your salvation, therefore no one can take any credit for any aspect of your salvation, I don't think that makes this ragdoll here. So let me come back to this flawed argument idea. And when you're coming through this and you begin to see this attack here, I think the best thing you can say is, who's he talking about? Who actually has this argument? Who is actually saying, for example, that Jesus is a rag doll? Do you ever hear any sermons like that? Maybe some people try to manipulate God, certainly, and all the things that are happening. But I prefer, you notice that I haven't hesitated from sometimes naming names, like I'm doing tonight, for example. And the reason I do that is because I think you ought to see that there really is a real person. Here's the book and the page that you can go to. You can check this out. I'm not really making this up. But when you read an argument that's about them, then that's always the dangerous thing. I have been a pastor long enough to have several visits when I was told about how they don't like something. And it only took me about 2 trips around the block before I started to say, who exactly are you talking about? Well, it's a lot of people. Okay. Where's my pen? I'll write them down. Let's just start from the door. Who are they? And often, what you find? Well, I don't want to disclose anything. Well, okay, then shut your mouth and leave. How's that? You can see I've made so many friends through the years. But I think that we ought to really, if there is a they, then they have a name, right? So let's put a name and a date and a place and all this to it to make it legitimate, because you really can't fight against hypotheticals. I am not at this point taking a position in the politics of the United States presidential election, and that's because there's nobody I'm really all that excited about positioning myself with. But nonetheless. Trump, of course, got in trouble this last week or so because of the way he answered a hypothetical question. And I learned a long time ago, and he probably has too, but you get snookered into these things, that a hypothetical question is always dangerous. You'll always step in it when you go in a hypothetical question. And so we ought to bring it down. So when you're reading a chapter like MacArthur's God, and you come through all this, and there's never really a person, a church, a denomination, a creed, or anything that's listed as really teaching what the accusation is, then I think we ought to really come and again question the assumptions, because maybe the argument or the presentation is just designed to get me to adopt an argument against a strong man. Now, here MacArthur comes, and he says that if this is true, and he's talking about the sovereignty of God, you remember that God rules over everything and he decrees everything that is. He says, if this is true, then believers deserve no credit for any aspect of their salvation. Then he begins to build again this argument that those who presumably believe that they do deserve credit for their salvation make Jesus into a doll or an action figure, and that Jesus serves at their command. Now, here's the idea that MacArthur says, that if you reject Calvinism, that is, that God has selected who's saved, then you believe that God can be manipulated. You say, well, how does he get there? Well, because he would say that you believe that this person walking down the road right now can be told, hey, there's a gift for you that you can receive, and he can turn to God and say, I receive it. MacArthur says that manipulates God. That makes you in charge instead of God in charge. Now, there's where I think we ought to dig in and question the assumptions. Is that really a manipulation of God? And if it is a manipulation of God also, does that give the person receiving the gift credit for that aspect of their salvation? It's your birthday, right? And you receive a gift. Do you take any credit for receiving the gift? No. You give thanks for receiving the gift, right? You didn't shop for it. You didn't pay for it, any of that kind of stuff. It's a gift that you have received. And yet, this is the argument that MacArthur and all of the Reformed theology really brings, I think, is if you actually received it on your own, then that is something that you would deserve credit for, that manipulates God instead of God being sovereign. And so it harms the sovereignty of God, they would say. He goes on in this chapter to say that churches have become apostate because they have rejected the sovereignty of God in salvation. Now, in that sense, he would say our church is apostate. I would say, first of all, we haven't rejected the sovereignty of God in salvation, have we? I haven't rejected the sovereignty of God in anything. And for the life of me, I don't get and understand how God cannot sovereignly allow people to choose to receive the gift if they want to. It seems to me that could be a sovereign choice, doesn't it? But this doesn't fit within Calvinism, that God could offer that choice. He says the sovereignty of God is the conviction that God orders everything, controls everything, and rules over everything. And so, of course, if you believe that God allows individuals to decide to receive the gift of salvation, then that harms this idea of the sovereignty of God. And he says that he is not subject to others' decisions. God is not subject to others' decisions. Can a father who, let's assume this father is fulfilling the biblical role of the leader of the home, can that sovereign of that home allow his wife to make a decision about what to cook for supper? And if he does allow his wife to make a decision about what to cook for supper, is he giving up the leadership of the home? Not at all. Can a CEO who owns the company wholly and has total authority, can he allow one of the employees to make a decision that affects the company? And does that make him no longer CEO? No, I mean, certainly a CEO can do that. So why can't we allow God to sovereignly allow this to happen? But again, MacArthur says that if someone chooses salvation, then this makes God subject to others' decisions. Now, he goes on page 165 to say, what about sin? God is not the author of sin, but he certainly allowed it. It is integral to his eternal decree. He certainly wasn't caught off guard or standing helpless to stop it when sin entered in the universe. This is what I see as MacArthur's flaw, because this is inconsistent to me. God cannot allow someone to choose salvation, but God could allow sin to come into the world. Again, these don't line up to me. So I don't understand this. He says on page 166, he is utterly sovereign. God controls all things, right down to choosing who will be saved. But on the same page, he says, those who reject the gospel do so voluntarily. This is the same page of the same book. I don't understand how God controls all things, but if you reject it, you do so voluntarily. If any of you figure that out, you can please let me know. And I put the page numbers there so that you can go check the book if you would like to do it. Page 167, he says, the very reason many contemporary churches embrace pragmatic theology is that they lack any understanding of God's sovereignty in the salvation of the elect. I think that statement is hyperbole. I do think that a lot of churches have embraced pragmatic methodology, which I agree with him is something that should be rejected. But is it because we, or those churches that do it, don't understand God's sovereignty? I think it's other reasons completely. They lose confidence in the power of the preached gospel to preach to hardened believers. Check that, read that again. They lose confidence in the power of the preached gospel to reach hardened unbelievers. Now, again, I think this is doublespeak, because remember that Calvinism believes that there has to be not only the outward call, but also what? The inward call. And isn't that a lack of confidence in the power of the preached gospel? Because they would say the power of the preached gospel isn't enough. You also have to have that inward call, or what they would call the effectual call. So I think there's just so much doublespeak and contradiction within Calvinism that I don't understand how very smart people like John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul and others adopt this so strongly. And when you ask them about this, and I had something on my Facebook today, you can go and read, and I do have two Calvinist friends. I did before today. But you go read some of this, and they give arguments, and they try to defend it, but again, maybe I'm not all that smart, but I can't understand, their argument doesn't make sense to me. And they even talk about something that, if I have this right, I'll apologize if I don't have this right, but they have something they call the doctrine of concurrence. And basically what the doctrine of concurrence is not something you find in the Bible, but is something they've made up to say, well, I know it seems like we're talking about two things that are mutually exclusive, but they just run along concurrently together. that to me is a weasel way out of saying there's no way we can make these things work, so we created a doctrine of concurrence. That means you can have your cake and eat it too. That's the doctrine of concurrence, I think. I'll study that someday and see if I got all that right. But it just doesn't seem to work for me. Let's look at the last quote here. If we could generate faith on our own, we would certainly have something to boast about. Now, I would agree with that, but I reject the Tulip system, TULINP, and I don't believe that we have anything to boast about. I don't think that we have created our own salvation just because we have the opportunity to accept our salvation. And I'm not really sure there's anybody out there who says it, certainly nobody with credibility that's teaching that. And if nobody is actually teaching something, do you remember what you call that? I think you call it a straw man, don't you? You created a scarecrow out there and said, well, he teaches it. And what's the nice thing about a scarecrow? They're very easy to defeat in a battle. And they're very easy to defeat in a battle. Why? Because they're fake. Right? And I'll fight a scarecrow any day and I'll win. And if I get to build the scarecrow, even better, right? So this is the straw man argument that is brought. So on MacArthur's issue here anyway, I would just say that I do fully believe in the sovereignty of God, and yet I refuse to accept this accusation that only Calvinists honor God's sovereignty. They often will hear, in fact, if you go into a church and you hear a lot of talk about sovereignty, and we preach God's sovereignty, we trust in the sovereignty of God, we honor the sovereignty of God, and you hear that term a lot, you can just go ahead, even if you're a Baptist, go ahead and gamble on the fact that you are in a Calvinist church, because they love that term sovereignty as it comes along. And I reject the fact that they would say, I reject the sovereignty of God. I actually think my sovereignty of God is bigger than their sovereignty, because I believe that God is sovereign enough to say, I'm going to let you all decide. That's not only sovereign, that is also good self-esteem, right? I have a God of good self-esteem. He's not shaken by those who may reject the gift that is paid in full. And I also fully reject the idea that he shares in the chapter that Calvinism, the doctrines of grace, as they sometimes call it as well, which I think is a strange way to say it, is the only hope for a healthy church. I think our church is healthy, and it rejects Calvinism. And I also think that Calvinism is, and Reformed theology is going to downgrade into a feeling-oriented social gospel that drifts into liberalism. This is where I think modern Calvinism is going. And if I had more time, I would give you plenty of examples of what is happening here. Strangely enough, this what today is a very theological movement, I think is shifting very quickly into a social gospel movement that is going to try to take dominion and restore all things, restore the kingdom of God, as they would say it, and bring about all this. So I think it's headed down a wrong path that I would like to reject. But with that, I want to then, in a few moments, talk about baptism in Calvinism, because this is another issue that is needed. Covenant theology, which is the same as Reformed theology, which is the same as Calvinism, if we can paint with a broad brush, has this idea that the elect are saved under a covenant of redemption. The covenant of redemption is for the elect and for their family. So this means that if you were born one of the elect, you are in a covenant family. And because you're in a covenant family then, it's going to lead to infant baptism, and almost always it's really the exception that those who don't hold to Calvinism don't baptize babies. And I think Baptists who reject infant baptism so far and yet hold to Calvinism, I think eventually they're going to get there. And there's lots of signs that this is happening among Baptists that I think give it long enough, and there will be Baptist churches probably even in the Southern Baptist Convention, that'll be baptizing babies. Because these two things really are so married together that you just can't bring them apart for very long. Now, the covenant is for the elect and their families, as I mentioned. And, of course, God made a covenant with Abraham. But it was not just with Abraham. It was also for all of his descendants. That's right. This Sunday, of course, we'll talk about the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and it was for his descendants. And in covenant theology, the Abrahamic covenant is adopted into, let me go about that the other direction. The new covenant, which they would say we're living under, which I don't. The new covenant is an outgrowth of the Abrahamic covenant. So it's all really part of one of the same. It's just a growing of these covenants. And they would say there's no, I'll use the word discontinuity several times tonight, no discontinuity between these covenants, and they would say then that there is a continuity between Old Testament circumcision and New Testament baptism. Now, that last line is the one you need to catch on and question that assumption. Is there a continuity between Old Testament circumcision and New Testament baptism? Now, Old Testament circumcision was a sign of the Abrahamic covenant, wasn't it? You can read about it in Genesis chapter 17. And if Old Testament circumcision was a sign of the the Abrahamic covenant, then New Testament baptism, they would say, is a sign of the new covenant. And so there's this continuity that goes together. But before we get to that, let's see what Martin Luther, who, of course, is kind of famous, isn't he? See what he had to say about baptism. He, of course, was one of the reformers of Reformed theology. And he says, these are his words, on infant baptism, whether children also believe and are justly baptized. Concerning this, we say briefly, let the simple dismiss this question from their minds and refer it to the learned. Can I stop right there? Martin Luther says, you stupid people, don't be asking questions like this. Leave it to the professor. And just trust us on this. Now, anyone who is a good Berean would say, time out. Don't tell me that this question is too complex for me to study on my own. But this is what Martin Luther said. So when people bring up Luther, just don't forget. Can I go till 8 o'clock tonight? Don't forget when people bring up Luther or anyone old and dead, we bring these people up like, well, if Luther said it, it's got to be right because he is old and dead and his name has lasted and his works have lasted. So he must be right? No, always question the assumptions. The only thing that we can totally go on is what? What I tell you, exactly. No, the Scriptures itself, the 66 books of the Scriptures. So the simple, that's you and me. He says, leave it to the learned on infant baptism. Then he says further, we say that we are not so much concerned to know whether the person baptized believes or not. He clearly was not a Baptist, was he? For on that account, that is, belief, on that account, baptism does not become invalid, but everything depends upon the word and command of God. Baptism is valid even though faith be wanting. I'm using, of course, some old English words. They're translated from Martin Luther's work. And what's he saying there? Baptism does a work even without faith. And that we ought to question quite seriously. Not all, in fact, John MacArthur would disagree with these words as well, I might say, but men like R.C. Sproul would very much accept these words. Going on, it says, now, before I go on, I have to tell you that Martin Luther hated Jews. He was an anti-Semite to the nth degree. He said you should take their passports and destroy them so that they cannot travel. You should close down their businesses, not do businesses with them. You should burn their houses and their synagogues. And let me just tell you that Hitler loved Martin Luther. And so much of this laid the ground for Hitler later. So when he says Jew here, he's using it in a very pejorative term. He says, for even though a Jew should today come dishonestly and with evil evil purpose, and we should baptize him in all good faith, we must say that his baptism is nevertheless genuine, even though he does not receive it as he should, just as those who unworthily go to the sacrament receive the true sacrament, even though they do not believe. So, what's Martin Luther's view of baptism? So clearly, obviously, there's a reason we are not Lutheran. Those most of us in here anyway are Baptist, and I know we do have some Lutherans online, in which case you can become a Baptist. But I do think, if I might stop here for just a moment, there really is a reason that there are different denominations, and the move to put all of us back together in some sort of an ecumenical spirit forgets that Lutherans have a very different view on baptism than Baptists do. And so to come together in one big happy fellowship would be fine for like a 4th of July picnic. But any kind of something of a spiritual nature, I think we would have to say, oh, wait a minute, you all meet at your church, we'll meet at our church, and we'll be Baptist, you be Lutheran. He goes on to say, thus you see that the objection of the sectarians is vain. For, as we have said, even though infants do not believe, yet their baptism as now shown would be valid, and no one should rebaptize them. R.C. Sproul has a very strong position on rebaptism, by the way. He does say in his book, that if you were baptized as a baby, unbelieving in a Lutheran, a Catholic, a Presbyterian, whatever home it is, and you were baptized as a baby, and you never followed the Lord all the way through, you got saved then when you were 62 years old, you should not be baptized because you were already baptized once. He holds this Lutheran view of baptism. So, just as nothing is detracted from the sacrament, though someone approach it with an evil purpose, and he could not be allowed on account of his abuse to take it a second time, as though he had not received the true sacrament of the first. For that would mean to blaspheme and profane the sacrament in the worst manner. How dare we think that God's word and ordinance should be wrong and invalid because we make wrong use of it? Now, very clearly, does Martin Luther believe that there is a power in baptism itself? Yes. I don't believe there's a power in baptism itself, by the way. We have water, and often when I baptize someone, give them a little, Baptist baptism class ahead of time, I'll say, now I want you to know that this water comes from the same source as the water in the toilet. It's the same water. It all comes from the city line right there. And that's all it is, just water. I can use clean water, dirty water, cold water, hot water, whatever, because it has no power in and of itself. Now, that's a little crass, perhaps, but I want to make sure they understand I'm just getting in water. That's it.
Just a side note, I think it should be pointed out that whatever power Martin Luther and Lutherans in general may ascribe to baptism or the Lord's Supper is not salvific in their view.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, an interesting comment that, I don't totally, you can enlighten us on this sometime. I don't totally understand, and R.C. Sproul is very strong on this too, that it doesn't save, and this is their position, it does not save, but it does have some sort of effect in which you should not do it twice. Now again, I don't understand the fine line of distinction that is there, but they do make a distinction there. That it is not saving, a distinction that most Baptists, I would admit, don't understand. He says, therefore, let it be decided that baptism always remains true, retains its full essence, even though a single person should be baptized and he, in addition, should not believe truly. But these people, the fanatics, anyone want to guess who the fanatics were? That was the separatists, the Baptists, the Anabaptists. The fanatics are so blinded that they do not see the word and command of God and regard baptism and the magistrates only as they regard water in brooks or in pots. I think, yes, pots. I did say that, didn't I? I'm going to stop right there just due to time. But he was very much against the Baptists. In fact, I don't understand again why Baptists are wanting to come back in with the Protestants when the Protestants used to kill the Baptists, and it was martyrdom, honestly, that used to take place. And so the last line: in order that we may not regard baptism as a mere empty sign, as the fanatics dream. Now, all that to come around and say the Calvinist position, again, not all Calvinists, because MacArthur would not agree with this. Sproul would agree with this, but the typical Reformed theology position, anyway, is that baptism is a sign and a seal of the covenant, just like circumcision was in days of old. Now, I'll let you read through several others that I'm going to skip due to time, but the question that I would ask, is there really a continuity between circumcision and baptism? And I would say, if there is, you can't find it in Scripture. I find in Scripture absolutely no connection between circumcision and baptism. That means if there is a connection, Luther or Sproul or somebody else made it up. And, it's worth whatever you want to attribute to things they make up. But I could make just as much connection between circumcision and lizards in Florida, I guess, if I make up something along the way. I think that there is a continuity between baptism and baptism. Isn't that clever? I don't think our baptism, Christian baptism, came from circumcision. I think it has no connection at all. I think they're totally different universes. But I do think our baptism is connected to Jewish baptism. And this December, when I take you to Israel, we'll stand at a mikveh, as I've mentioned before, and I'll say at that mikveh, this is the origins of Christian baptism. And you're going to look in that mikveh, and it's going to look very much like that thing right there. And it's going to have stairs that go down into it, and it's going to have a dead end then once you get in there. And it's going to just be a pool that water would have gone into, and it is the baptistry pool. And John the Baptist happened to do it in a river. It was done in mikveh, but that's where our baptism come from. That, in the Old Testament, that was, first of all, it was symbolic. It didn't have any kind of power to it. It was by immersion in water. It was meaningless in and of itself. Jewish baptism, John's baptism, it was, again, symbolic. And it was not really related to the covenant. It wasn't a sign of the covenant, of the Abrahamic covenant. Circumcision was a sign of the covenant. And circumcision remained. John the Baptist never said, now don't get circumcised. The issue of circumcision didn't come up in the church until until the church was born, I guess, until Paul came along, and Paul said, hey, these Gentiles don't need to be circumcised. You know why? Because they're not part of the Abrahamic covenant. There's no continuity between the church and the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant carries on in something else. So I think what we have when it comes to baptism and so many other things in Tulip, or Calvinist theology, is you've got a lot of assumptions that are made that are invalid assumptions. And then they're just all mixed and stirred in together in order to build then what is a logical argument, provided that those assumptions are true. And I think from the get-go, we ought to question the assumptions. Now grow tulips in your garden and not in your theology, and all will be well. Next week we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or at least tell you a story of little widow ladies who are going to lose their Social Security and whatever else I can come up with to divert attention. Let's have a word of prayer together.